Hey guys, all right, this is going to be possibly our last video of the year. Okay, we're going to be talking tonight about the end of the Cold War, and if you're following along in your notes, then I'm kind of skipping over Vietnam, and the reason I'm doing so is not because I'm not covering Vietnam, but if you look at the Google Classroom page, I posted two or three videos on Vietnam itself that I thought explained Vietnam better than I could. Okay, so it's not that I'm not covering Vietnam, but I already have videos and lectures posted on that from different people. The Khan Academy video is very, very good. It is very detailed. And again, it explains the Vietnam War much better than I could myself. And then the crash course history is talking about the Korean and the Vietnam Wars, both of those combined, and their role in the Cold War. So I suggest checking out those two videos um, to learn more about Vietnam. Vietnam is one of the most important wars of the 20th century. And just because I'm not necessarily going to be talking about it myself in my lectures, it is very, very important. Matter of fact, it was the last major war before we get to the 21st century. Lasted for a long time, as you could tell if you read through the notes and if you really paid attention to the dates. You're talking about a long, long war here. One of the longest, probably the longest that we have been involved in until we get to the 2000s. A very controversial war. And I do want to say this just right quick before I move on into the end of the Cold War. There were a lot of protests in the Vietnam War. It was very controversial because the draft was really used extensively all the way through the Vietnamese War. It was all about trying to keep South Vietnam from turning communist. Again, all this was connected with the Cold War. Just like Korea, we were trying to keep South Vietnam from becoming communist. We were trying to stop the spread of communism. As part of the Truman Doctrine, we were trying to contain communism, and that's exactly what Vietnam was fought about. And because of the increased portrayal by the media, you have to think at this point in time, especially as we get into the later 60s, you have a lot of live television footage. For the first time, war is televised. And even in World War II and the Korean War, you didn't have that kind of media, that kind of technology to actually televise a war. Now you do in the 60s and 70s. And so as a result, people now see the devastation that war brings. And there was certainly a lot of protest. I read a video or I saw a video last week or read it. I found somewhere that stated that most people throughout the 1960s still supported the Vietnam War. But what you heard about were all the protests on college campuses and in certain places. So not necessarily the entire United States was a protest. That certainly was not the case. But that's what the media focused on. Our media focuses on whatever they want to, on whatever is newsworthy. So the Vietnam War for a long, long time was very controversial because of that. Should we be involved in that war? Should we let Vietnam basically handle this themselves? And again, it was all part of the Cold War and trying to stop and contain communism. So as we go further into the 1970s and we get into the latter part of the Cold War, tonight we're going to be focused on the final events of the Cold War. We've already talked about pretty much the heart of the Cold War itself, why it began, the whole idea of the Red Scare and the potential for nuclear warfare. You had fallout shelters, you had nuclear bomb drills in the schools. And I'm going to post several videos this week that you can go back and look at. Typically this time of year, I show a lot of video clips, just like I did with World War II. The problem that I'm having is that a lot of those video clips comes from movies and even TV shows that I have that I could show in class. I'm having a hard time finding the clips that I need on YouTube. So I will keep searching for the video clips that I want to show you guys. And I will post them as I find them. There's a lot on the Cold War, a lot about Kennedy himself, and as we go into the 1980s. So this week, that's going to be my goal, is to find a lot of those film clips from different movies and TV shows and post those. All right, so we're talking tonight about the end of the Cold War. Okay, how does the Cold War end? Okay, we get that close to nuclear warfare with the Soviet Union. In my last video, we talked about that. That with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs invasion, there are several things there between Kennedy and Khrushchev that that really could have gotten into war at any point in time. We get very, very close to not only war, but nuclear war with the Soviet Union. As we go into the latter part of the 60s, the Cold War begins to calm down a little bit. Okay, it is not over by any means, but the whole threat of warfare really begins to settle down a good bit. Now, in the meantime, in 1969, keep in mind that we were in the space race with the Soviet Union, and I covered that last week when we began talking about the Cold War. Then I talked about it wasn't just this fighting between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was competition for everything. It was a nuclear arms buildup to see who could have the most nuclear weapons, to see who could have the most powerful military, and it revolved around everything. It came down to who was better in sports, and especially when it came to this whole space race. That for the first time in history, our goal is to get satellites into outer space, and then the first man into outer space, and then the first man on the moon. And the Soviets were ahead of us in all of those in regards to the space race. The space race all throughout the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet Union had kicked our tails for most of this. We seem to be 2 or 3 steps behind them in this whole fight to get into space. But on July 20th, 1969, we finally win. We get a big victory. Apollo 11 is going to land on the moon, and we have, for the first time in history, a man that walks on the moon. That happens with Neil Armstrong. He becomes the first, as well as Buzz Aldrin. Armstrong and Aldrin, part of the Apollo 11 mission, are going to be the first 2 men to walk on the moon, and they are Americans. So even though the Soviets had been 2 or 3 steps ahead of us throughout the entire space race, the ultimate goal was to make it to the moon. No one had ever made it to the moon before. No human being had ever stepped foot on the moon before. That was the coup de grace. That was the holy grail. Who could make it to the moon first? That was the final race. And we did it on July 20th, 1969. So as the 60s comes to a close, and what a decade the 1960s was. As that comes to a close, such a huge uplift for the United States. You have to look at what all happened in the 1960s. You're talking about what I just mentioned, the Kennedy administration. You're going from Eisenhower to Kennedy. Really a complete changing of the guards, going from older Eisenhower of the military to the younger, charismatic Kennedy. You have the Bay of Pigs invasion. You have the Cuban Missile Crisis. You have the Civil Rights Movement as well. Kennedy is assassinated in November of 1963, and that brings us into a whole new era of history with Lyndon Johnson and the ramping up of Vietnam. In 1968, we get more tragedy. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Bobby Kennedy, the brother of President John Kennedy, is running for president in 1968 and is probably going to win. He's assassinated in California during the presidential race. And so you're talking about the 60s was just a lot of tragedy. And if there was one decade in the 1900s that I did not want to be a part of, outside of the Great Depression, I would have to say that the 1960s are it. I just have no interest in going back and living through the 60s because there's a lot of stuff that happened. Now, historically speaking, it's jam-packed with a lot of stuff. But you have so many things happening, and I know that there are a lot of great things that happen as well. Don't get me wrong. A lot of great things happen in the 60s, but also a lot of bad things as well. Matter of fact, I think CNN has a series out. They do these decade series, 1960s and the 70s and the 80s. And their series on the 1960s is flat out phenomenal. And it is very lengthy because there's just so much that happens. I watched it about a year and a half ago. And if you get a chance, I think that it's still on Netflix. If you get a chance, check it out. There are several different episodes, and there's just a lot that goes on. You had the Vietnam protest. So with all of that happening, we finish out the decade with one very bright spot in that we defeat the Soviets in landing on the moon first. So as we get into the 1970s, we get into a new era of the Cold War. And we actually began to get into some talks about peace. Beginning in 1969, we began a peace agreement with the Soviets called SALT I, SALT 1, SALT. Talks began in 1969, and 3 years later, in May of 1972, SALT I is finally signed and agreed upon by both the United States and the Soviet Union. What SALT I is going to do is that it's going to stop and limit the production of nuclear weapons. So SALT I means that, this whole time, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union have been building up our nuclear arsenal. I mean, massive upon massive, enough to destroy the entire world several times over. And so, with SALT I in 1972, both countries agreed to begin to limit our production of nuclear weapons. As soon as SALT I is agreed upon, they'll begin peace negotiations for what's called SALT II. That is finally signed in June of 1979. Takes 7 years, but we finally come up with SALT II. SALT II is going to further limit the production of our entire nuclear arsenal. And so throughout the 1970s, what we have here is that between the United States and the Soviet Union, we're actually coming to an agreement here. We're seeing the end of the Cold War. Now, this is going to take a couple of decades. As a matter of fact, the Cold War is not going to end until the early 1990s. And so it's going to take about a good 20 years or so before the Cold War officially comes to an end. But for this last 20 years of the Cold War, we do see some attempts by both the Soviet Union and the United States to scale this thing back a little bit. Again, the early 1960s is when we really came close to not only warfare with the Soviet Union, but nuclear warfare. And as we get to the 1970s and the 1980s, they were trying to find a way to get to not have war and to end this whole thing altogether. In December of 1979, the Soviets are going to invade Afghanistan. So SALT II is signed in June of 1979, and it looks like the Cold War is about to come to an end. Really, in June of 1979, it looks like this whole thing is about to come to an end. Peace talks began with President Richard Nixon in 1979, and is signed in 1972. Little side note here. Richard Nixon it gets caught up in the Watergate scandal, and he will serve as president until 1974, because he basically lies under oath. Is very clear. President Nixon is not going to be impeached. We talked earlier this year about President Trump was the second president to be, the third president to be impeached in history. The other two were President Andrew Johnson and then President Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Richard Nixon was not impeached because he resigns before that happens. Okay, Richard Nixon probably would have been the first president in history to have been removed from office from impeachment. Because the evidence was so stacked up against him. But he resigns in 1974. He resigns from president of the United States. And so therefore he's going to avoid impeachment. But Nixon always has that black mark on his record for the rest of his life. He will live for another 20 years. And that is always his black mark. As a matter of fact, that brings us into a brand new part of history. Because not only does Richard Nixon resign, but his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign a year before. Spiro Agnew, the vice president, was also caught up in the Watergate scandal. So what you have here is that for the first time in U.S. history, we go down to the list of secession for presidents, and we get down to number 3, which was the Speaker of the House, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford is the only president in U.S. history to not be elected to vice president or president, but yet holds both offices. He was Speaker of the House in 1973, and when Spiro Agnew resigned, Gerald Ford became vice president. When Richard Nixon resigned in 1974, then Gerald Ford became president of the United States. So a little side note there of important piece of American history. But Gerald Ford will not win re-election in 1976. As a matter of fact, he becomes president and doesn't even win any election whatsoever. In 1976, Jimmy Carter is elected president. And so Jimmy Carter, in June of 1979, finally completes the SALT II deals. But 6 months later, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. And when this happens, then it pretty much blows the whole deal out of the water, okay? Because this agreement had been made in between President Carter and the Soviet Union, which at this point was Gorbachev. Um, but when the Soviets invade Afghanistan in December, the Congress refuses to sign the peace treaty, and so SALT II never actually fully goes into place. So we have here is that we had the beginning of peace in between the United States and the Soviet Union, but we're not quite there yet. And then in the 1980s, in comes President Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is elected president in 1980, comes into office in 1981. And one of Reagan's biggest goals here is to end the Cold War. Now, Reagan comes into a mess. The United States is in a recession. Economically, we're in a bad spot. You have the Iranian oil crisis, where gas is sky high. Gas has to be rationed out back in the late 1970s. We see a cultural movement here because you had all these muscle cars and these gas guzzler sports cars like the Dodge Challenger and the Charger and the Chevelles and the Mustangs and the Camaros and all these souped up cars. And because of this gas crisis in the 1970s, then companies quit making those cars, and we get more towards the gas-saving sedans in the 1980s, much smaller cars that use much less gas. And so we see a little trend there in regards to the automotive industry. So Ronald Reagan comes in 1981, and he has a lot to handle. But his first and foremost goal is to end the Cold War. Okay, that is his plan. In 1985, he finally comes to an agreement with the Soviet Union. I said Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 70s. I was mistaken. Gorbachev didn't actually come into power until 1985. I cannot remember who was actually the Soviet dictator in 1979. But Gorbachev does not come into place until 1985. And 1985 is where we're going to pick up. Okay, so SALT II was agreed upon in 1979, but it's never actually ratified. Again, the Soviets invade Afghanistan, and it pretty much takes the whole deal off the table. As a matter of fact, if you think to our last study guide, there was a question towards the end that had to do with us helping out Afghanistan. Okay, when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, we give Afghanistan aid and we give them weapons to fight off the Soviet invasion. And one of those men who were trying to fight off that we help is a man named Osama bin Laden. And so for 6 years there, we pretty much back off and go back to the table and say, okay, you invaded Afghanistan. This went against our deal. So let's try to start over. Well, in 1985, President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev are going to come back to the table to try to come up with an agreement. So the two sides agreed to abide by SALT II until 1985. And then when Gorbachev takes power, really, he automatically begins a process of kind of slowing down communism in the Soviet Union. He has two different programs, Glasnost and Perestroika, that he puts into place. Glasnost is going to be the openness to allow Western ideas and goods into the Soviet Union. And Perestroika is going to allow limited market incentives for the Soviet citizens. So what you have here for the first time in many, many years in the Soviet Union is kind of an open, not necessarily an open borders, but an open trade market. You know, it wasn't just democracy versus communism in the whole Cold War. The Soviet Union pretty much cut themselves off from the Western world, Western Europe. You had the Berlin Wall that's put up there in Berlin to where you could just go between East and West Berlin. The communist controlled Soviet Union was cut off from the rest of the world. I mean, you go back and look at Eastern European countries in the 1970s and 1980s, and you will talk about just a heap of mess. Their automobiles were some of the worst ever made. Their technology was horrible because the Soviets had cut themselves off from the United States and from Western Europe. So in 1985, when Gorbachev comes into power, he begins to have more of an open mind about allowing some of that technology and some of that trade going back and forth. I want to say this is probably not a very popular thing to say, but Gorbachev deserves a lot of credit here. Gorbachev was by no means a great man, but Gorbachev here is going to be the man that really kind of opens the way to end the Cold War, because the United States had been wanting to end the Cold War. Okay, between Nixon, Ford, Carter, and now Reagan, we wanted to end the Cold War. But the Soviets had resisted time and time again. Now it appears that Gorbachev is finally going to be the man that is willing to let some of this kind of die down a little bit. And so in 1985, Reagan and Gorbachev began peace negotiations in what's called START, S-T-A-R-T. START would drastically reduce the number of nuclear weapons in both the United States and in the Soviet Union. The negotiations are going to begin in 1985, and then 6 years later, the agreement is finally made in 1991. And that is made during President George W. Bush's presidency. And so what we have here is a very, very close to having an ending here in the Cold War. As we go from the mid to late 1980s, it looks like the Cold War is going to end. The question is, exactly when is that going to happen? You can tell that we're getting to that point. We're just not quite there yet. In 1987, about a year and a half before President Reagan leaves office, he has a speech there in Berlin, there at the Brandenburg Gate where the wall is. And he gives his famous speech, basically telling Gorbachev that if you truly want peace, if you truly want openness, then open the gates, open the wall, tear down this wall. And I'll post this video onto the classroom page where you can see this video. But it's one of the most famous speeches of the Cold War, certainly one of the most famous speeches of President Reagan, his tear down this wall speech. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And that's pretty much Reagan's kind of throwing it in his face of, hey, you say that you want peace, you say that you want to end this whole thing, prove it. Tear down the Berlin Wall. Show us that you're serious about ending this whole thing and about having an open trade market. So as we go into the go from the 1980s into the 1990s, then things are looking very, very positive. Again, the question is exactly how and when is the Cold War going to end? In June of 1989, we get our answer. Poland, who is on the eastern border of Germany, had been controlled by the Soviet Union ever since the end of World War II, is going to vote to become non-communist. Okay. Again, these Eastern European nations were independent and allowed to choose for their own in regards to government. But make no mistake about it, the Soviet Union had a lot of control over those Eastern European nations. Okay, they may not have been the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union dictator had a lot of control over Poland and a lot of those Eastern European nations. Well, in June of 1989, Poland says, you know what, communism stinks. We don't want it anymore. Forget this junk. And they vote to have a more democratic government. So for the first time in a long time since Yugoslavia, an Eastern European nation is going to break away from communism and break away from the Soviet Union, and they're going to be fully independent once again. And the entire world is watching, thinking, what is Gorbachev going to do? Is Gorbachev going to overreach his boundaries? And is he going to force Poland to go back communist? Is he going to take some kind of action? Is he going to denounce it? Or are we going to have an increase in tensions here? And Gorbachev does nothing. He does not respond. He doesn't come out against it. He doesn't come out for it. He just ignores that it even happens. So as a result, other Eastern European nations are going to do the exact same thing. Guys, here's the thing about communism. Once you get a taste of it, you don't want it anymore. Okay, the people do not want communism. I know the ideas sound great, that there is no government and that everybody shares everything and that everybody is equal in regards to financial. It's a great concept, but it has never historically worked. Okay, feel free to prove me wrong on that. Okay, that's not my opinion. That is history. Historically speaking, communism has never truly worked. In the communist nations that we've had over the last 100 years, what you get is a dictatorship. Okay, you don't get a society that doesn't have government and where everybody's equal financially, you get the exact opposite. You get a dictator, and the people are an oppressed people. That's exactly what you had in the Soviet Union. That's what you had in China. That's what you had in North Korea, and that's what you had in Vietnam. Guys, these Eastern European nations were itching to get away from the Soviet Union and itching to get away from communism. They just didn't have the power to do it before. Poland has taken that step, and they said, I don't care what Gorbachev says, we're going to do it anyway. And Gorbachev just ignores that Poland even exists. So other Eastern European nations are going to follow suit and say, well, hey, Poland did it, let's do it as well. And before you know it, Eastern European nations begin to fall away from communism. We now see that the Cold War is now coming to an end. We see that Gorbachev is serious and that he is not trying to overreach his power anymore. And again, I may be wrong here, but in all my studies and research, I think that Gorbachev really deserves a lot of credit. Reagan deserves a lot of credit. Carter, Ford, Nixon, all of them deserve a lot of credit. But really, it kind of comes down to the other side as well. The Soviet Union has to also be willing to end this thing before the Cold War finally comes to an end. And the Soviet Union now finally has a dictator in Gorbachev that's willing to do that. In the fall of 1989, not only do we get Eastern European nations that are breaking away from communism, but the Berlin Wall begins to come down. Germans in East and West Germany, East and West Berlin, they began to tear down the Berlin Wall. Now, you could have done this 10, 20 years earlier because you had Soviet soldiers there stationed at the wall. They would have shot you dead in a heartbeat if you even try to cross over the wall. But the orders have come down to the soldiers. Do not touch the people. And so regular German citizens began to hammer and chisel away at the concrete and the steel barrier that had been running all the way down the middle of Berlin for, at this point, almost 30 years. And again, the Soviet Union just sits there and watches. Gorbachev lets it happen. He doesn't care. In 1990, the wall is officially torn down. And that symbol of the Cold War is now finally over. That symbol of this U.S. versus Russian hatred for so long, it looks like it's finally coming down to an end. In the summer of 1991, there is a coup to overthrow Gorbachev. They forced Gorbachev into house arrest, and you have a new government that's set up. The nationalist leader, Boris Yeltsin, is going to help to end the coup. And the army is on the side of Boris Yeltsin. I've been telling you guys for months now, if the army is against you, you better watch out. But if the army is with you, then you have a lot of power. Well, the army in the Soviet Union, or in Russia, as it's quickly becoming here, is behind the Nationalist Party and their leader, Boris Yeltsin, which means that Boris Yeltsin now has the power. He now has the power to do what he needs to. So in December of 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapses, which means that the Soviets are no longer in power. The USSR now becomes back Russia again. Okay, they're no longer called the Soviet Union. They go back to being known as just simply Russia. Gorbachev is gone. He is out of power. Boris Yeltsin becomes the first president of the new Russia, and the Cold War is over. Okay, this thing has gone on from the 1940s after World War II into 1991. You're talking about a good 40, 45 years here that the Cold War has gone on. And in those 45 years, look at all the things that we've seen. We've seen a potential nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviets. You've seen us involved in wars in Korea and Vietnam to try to stop the spread of communism. In that, we had to fight China in both wars. You had Fidel Castro down in Cuba that for many, many years we were expecting to go to war with him if need be. Now, Castro didn't have that kind of power. If Castro goes to war with the U.S., you better watch out because we're going to obliterate Cuba. But that leads us to the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And for many, many years, really up until the last few years, relations between the United States and Cuba still had that strain. It's going to take until Fidel Castro is now out of power and for the new Cuban leader, which actually ended up being Fidel's brother, I think it's Raul Castro, is going to begin to open up Cuba's borders again. And so you have a 45-year period of the Cold War. The Cold War never really brought us into war between the Russians and the Americans. Now, yes, we fought wars because of this, We fought Vietnam and Korea because of communism, but the United States and Russia never actually went head to head. Outside of those two conflicts, we never really went head to head into an all-out war. And thankfully, that never happened, because if it would have, then it would have been a nuclear war. So again, when it comes to ending the Cold War, a lot of leaders get credit here. And again, it's hard to give a whole lot of credit to Nixon because of Watergate, but really Nixon did a lot of good. Nixon is always overshadowed because of Watergate and his resignation. But as president, Nixon was actually a pretty good president. You're talking about Nixon was the one that ended the Vietnam War and the end of the draft. He was the one that began the peace negotiations with the Soviet Union. Nixon did a lot of good. So Nixon and Ford and Carter and Reagan and then Bush. And then before them, you had Kennedy, which was such a strong leader against the Soviet Union, and Eisenhower and Truman. And then finally, the Cold War is over. Now, the Cold War is a distant memory in our minds. It's been over for almost 30 years at this point. Okay, it ended in 1991. It is now the year 2020. So you're talking about almost 30 years that the Cold War has been over. That's longer than any of you have been alive. The Cold War ended when I was a kid. Matter of fact, I remember the Berlin Wall being torn down. I remember watching it on the news and on TV. They broadcast it live. I was 7 years old. I was really too young to understand what was going on, but I knew it was something big. So the Cold War ending is a major, major thing that happens in world history because it's the end of what could have been another world war, really. You're talking about having a potential another world war if this thing goes sour, and a nuclear war. Things could have really gotten really, really bad very quickly. Luckily, it never did. And the Cold War comes and goes, and a lot of good things begin to happen again. Again, Europe has changed many, many times over the years. Matter of fact, I have a globe down in my garage that I got rid of last week. That is a map of the mid 1980s. It still has the USSR and Yugoslavia and some of those old European nations that don't exist anymore. And so in the last 30 years, we've come a long way to get past the Cold War. But that gives you an understanding about why relations between the U.S. and Russia are still strained. We're still not technically allies with Russia. Yeah, we act like we're friends and allies and things like that. But ever since the Cold War ended, there's still been a strain in between the U.S. and the Russians, especially since Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin was a part of what used to be the old KGB during the Soviet Union, and Putin hasn't exactly been the best thing for Russia. He is the president of Russia. He's been elected president several times. Okay, they don't have term limits, and there's been a lot of times where Putin has not done the right things for Russia, and so there are still a lot of tensions in between the U.S. and Russia because of what happened in the Cold War. Obviously, we're still dealing with the North Korean crisis with Kim Jong-un. And who knows what's going on with him right now? There are reports saying that he's in bad health and maybe he's even died. I don't know if there's any truth to that. But you're talking about more than 50 or 60 years at this point, 70 years really since the Korean War, and we are still at odds with North Korea. Okay, Kim Jong-un is still firing nuclear weapons at Japan and our allies. And so we are still feeling the effects of the Cold War today, even though the Cold War is over. Now, I do want to talk about one more thing before I finish up. And I know I'm going a little past where I want to. But tomorrow in our Zoom meeting, we're going to talk about 9/11. And we're going to take time to talk about September 11, 2001. I'm going to tell you about my experiences and what 9/11 leads to. But there's one more event that we need to talk about before we get there. In that not only does the Cold War end in 1991, but that brings us into a new era and into a new actual war. And that war is the Gulf War. Okay. In the summer of 1990, as the Cold War is coming to an end, there is a new threat. Now, it's not necessarily towards the United States, but it is towards one of our allies. And that threat is in Kuwait. Okay. Now we're going to the Middle East here. Iraq versus Kuwait. Iraq has a dictator named Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein was a very, very bad man. He was a murderer. He was just a horrible, horrible man. And Saddam Hussein was the dictator of Iraq. Well, on August the 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein is going to invade the tiny country of Kuwait. If you look at a map, Kuwait is a very small country on the southeastern border of Iraq. Well, why would Saddam Hussein want to invade Kuwait? Well, that's because Kuwait is a major oil supplier. Okay, the Middle East is kind of a weird situation here because the Middle East is nothing but desert, mostly nothing but third world countries, very, very poor countries in most cases, not the United Arab Emirates. But the people of those countries are very, very poor. You would talk about countries that are very unstable, but it's where most of the oil comes from in the world. And Kuwait was a major oil supplier for the world, including for the United States. So Saddam Hussein is going to invade Kuwait on August the 2nd, 1990, and then he's going to threaten to invade Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a much bigger country, much more oil supply. Matter of fact, if Iraq was successful in invading Saudi Arabia, then Saddam Hussein would have controlled 1/5 of the entire world supply of oil. Now, you don't want Saddam Hussein or any kind of dictator to control that much oil. You want to talk about a complete disaster. So as a result, the United States is going to get involved. And on August 7th, 1990, we begin what's called Operation Desert Shield. Now, this is called the beginning of the Gulf War. Okay, the United States had not been involved in a war since Vietnam. We're talking about 1973, 1974, since the United States had been in an all-out war. So 1990 comes, and Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait and threatens to invade Saudi Arabia. If he's successful, he controls 20% of the world's oil supply. We cannot let that happen. So Operation Desert Shield begins on August the 7th. Now, this is going to come into two different ways: Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm. Operation Desert Shield is going to be a defense system to defend Saudi Arabia. Again, Hussein invades Kuwait, threatens to invade Saudi Arabia. So Desert Shield is going to protect Saudi Arabia to make sure that Saddam Hussein does not invade Saudi Arabia. So we set a defense line in Saudi Arabia, and we pretty much warn Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait or we're going to come after you. So Operation Desert Shield takes place from August the 7th, 1990 to January 15th of 1991. On January the 16th, 1991, we begin Operation Desert Storm, where we're going to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Okay, we have defended the border of Saudi Arabia. Now we're going to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait for good. That begins Operation Desert Shield. A shield is like a defense mechanism. So that's what Operation Desert Shield was. It was defense. A storm is firepower. Okay, so that's when Operation Desert Storm begins. It's going to be our attack against Saddam Hussein. That begins on January the 16th. Begins with thousands of bombing missions of Iraq. The ground war is going to begin on February the 24th, which means that we send soldiers in the ground to liberate Kuwait. And within 100 hours, Kuwait will be free from the control of Saddam Hussein. And on February the 28th, the Gulf War is over. Now, this does a couple of different things. First of all, it displayed that the United Nations and the unity of nations are going to work. Okay, this showed the power of the UN really being put into action. Okay, Saddam Hussein was clearly wrong here. He was clearly trying to invade other countries, and so the United States, the United Nations, Great Britain, France, even the Soviet Union are going to support this. So it shows that the UN and the unity of different nations are going to be successful. It also stops Saddam Hussein. Okay, so Operation Desert Shield and Operation Desert Storm, you're talking about a 6-7 month period here that is now called the Gulf War. Matter of fact, many of you guys probably have relatives who were veterans of the Gulf War, maybe even parents that were veterans of the Gulf War. The Gulf War was crucial. It was very quick, very successful, but again, meant a lot to the United States because, again, it was our first war since Vietnam. It was our first major war. And even though it didn't even last a year, it was a major, major accomplishment in defeating Saddam Hussein. Now, we didn't take out Saddam Hussein. Okay, we liberate Kuwait, and Saddam Hussein is pushed back into Iraq, but we leave Saddam Hussein alone. Okay, we're going to come back to Saddam Hussein later on because in 2003, we have unfinished business with Saddam Hussein. So we're not finished talking about him yet. But this is going to bring us up into the 1990s, into the end of the 20th century, okay? Throughout the 1990s, there are several other military conflicts and a lot of things going on across the world. But really, our next major thing is going to be September 11th, 2001. So tomorrow in our Zoom meeting, that's what we're going to talk about. Get ready to answer some questions. I'm going to ask you guys a few questions. I want you to respond a little bit, but hopefully it'll be a lesson that that really means a lot to you. I usually spend a whole week going over 9/11, and unfortunately, this situation won't let me do so. But we have finished the Cold War. The Cold War is over after 45 years. Look at all the things that's happened in between the end of World War II, 1945, 1946, with the beginning of the Cold War, and into 1991. Look at all the conflicts, the wars, assassinations, all different kinds of things. So as we get into the 21st century with the 2000s, then we're brought into a new era of world history. See you guys tomorrow. Hope you have a good night.